Now, for all of those who are not privy to what they're watching, this is a channel that deals with popular culture, the industry of mass marketed capitalism, and how that filters into the arts, and how the art in and of itself resonates into the experience of the people, quote unquote the audience, aka you guys. So what the headspace is about is initiating a constant dialogue between the people that capitalism directs its productivity towards and needs in order to sustain itself. That's you again. And the idea or ideology in and of itself. What are these powerful systems of control that keep in place the policies, the laws, the general attitudes that make up the world we live in today, particularly as Africans, but more narrowed into the South African context, because this is where we be at. So, what an interesting time to be South African, as it were, right at the heels of second time in a row win from the South African rugby team, which I guess was not a major shock for many, even though New Zealand were classically formidable opponents. There is definitely a recognition of the dominance that South African rugby has on an international level. Therefore, they've always been candidates for the cup, if not been instantaneous expectants to win it. So, right in the atmosphere of the frenzy with the people that live in this country celebrating, there seems to be a very fertile sense of backlash going on in social media. And if there's anything one must realize about social media, it's that there's always going to be contrary for contrary's sake. So it wasn't surprising to see people who go from not supporting the Springboks to vehemently being against the idea of even celebrating. Going as far as saying any black South African and any South African in general who celebrates the win of the Springboks is celebrating the load shedding, is celebrating the levels of poverty, is celebrating the rife unemployment of youth, is celebrating the seemingly ceaseless barrage of corruption. In other words, is celebrating everything wrong with South Africa as we experience it. Now for me, I felt like that was a little bit too much. Because although I understand the feeling of not attaching yourself to South Africa in its victories, because look bro, I live in the hood. And up in Makasana, I see the direct experiences of what the majority of South Africans ignore and neglect. And the irony is that it is these very same neglected people whose folk culture is taken and translated into some kind of commodity to sell back to them. So, on a personal level, I felt the need to use this blessed platform that we have to start this conversation. Is it treachery to celebrate the Springboks' victory as a black South African or as a South African in general? Or do we have the right, we, again, South Africans, to honor this moment and see something that genuinely does develop us, if anything? Or is it simply sheer tokenism and mass-marketed symbolism here to just pull us into throwing swabs of money into the very same system which destroys us? My answer is that it's both. And I think it is this both angle that social media understates, because the algorithms feed on silos of mass opinion. They segment people into different kinds of groups, and thereby social media enhances antagonism. That's the nature of it, because it is made in a way where it looks for people you relate with or are likely to relate with. It will not show you a nuanced dynamic of what is out there. It will only show you what you've been looking for. And if we're being honest about it, people fundamentally look for the two things online: the things that they're really into, and they read up a little bit about the things that they're not into. And it's this binary logic of trying to understand, or at least trying to be in the know about what you do like, but also to understand the opposite of what you don't, which creates a divisive pattern of messaging that you receive on your phone or in any other medium of communication. So it's this contrarian structure to the way that the internet is set up that makes things, and by things I mean conflicts, feel more binary and moralistic, when there's a whole lot more, again this word, nuance, very crucial here. Moralism attempts to structure things according to good and bad. But the reality of politics, life experience, sports, arts, is that you just can't narrow people into the standard of whether or not they're good or bad. Because the good and bad rests on particular principles, and we don't all share the same uniformed ideas about what's good or bad. And this is partly what creates the need for conflict. Yes, the need. Conflict is a very much natural process that allows for ideas to come into contact with each other and thereby feed into, feed off of, and engage, strike upon each other to ultimately emerge with the possibility of what is valid. Not what is good or bad, but what is valid. Because ultimately this is what the lines of history can teach us. It is what is valid that stays and becomes resilient. And by valid I mean what can resiliently contain, maintain, and sustain itself. And there's different strategies on how ideas live on. Some ideas live on by virtue of oppressing others. Some ideas live on by virtue of just being more adaptive. And it's this climate of understanding how ideas either oppress or adapt that social media hides from us. All we see are the verses, and I mean VS. We see people seemingly against each other when there's a whole lot more at the root of why they don't see eye to eye. And so using this concept or this theme of rugby, the history of South Africa as a country is a union that is a colonial settler state established by British empires who, in the advent of adjusting and working out their own territory with other movements and clans such as the Afrikaners, were able to invade spaces which belonged to the people who were indigenous to the land. And it is this invasion, this oppression, that sits at the root of what South Africa became. It became this place where people of European descent could come and dig in a portion of their own wealth at the expense of those who had lived and honored this land before. And these contradictions, these fights, and these divisions and collusions and different parts of history are what make up the nightmarish dream that is South Africa. with parts of hope and aspiration, but also with parts of tragedy and pain, till this day. So now, the ending of apartheid signified a moment where the seat of power, politically speaking, became black faces. But for those who know their inner political history, the ANC coming into power and Mandela becoming president was not this romantic idea of heroes ushering in a new era. It was simply a movement negotiating itself into what it thought was the best place of power possible at that time. Because many consider that move in itself a compromise. Where many were ready for all-out revolutionary warfare to be engaged with the colonial settler, the ANC chose to literally sit down and talk with people who had formerly allowed and conceptualized policies that destroyed the black South African. So it is this point in history at which the conflict of what resonates today, of a South Africa which pretends to be free but is a big compromise. And I don't think compromise is such a bad thing. I get compromise gets a bad rep. And I want to go into that and how it inevitably links into mass market media, including how sports is given to us as an activity, but also as a business. Let's go. So, the essence of this narrative is that politics is a groundworks of compromise. When I say a groundworks of compromise, it's a place where ideologies try to meet each other in mutual places. And sometimes this is a meeting together that comes in ways that don't have to turn into all-out warfare. Sometimes it is. And in the case of South Africa, it didn't have to be the kind of warfare which became incessantly physical. Most of it elevated itself into the level of theory and ideas, and became this insidious legacy that we live with of certain black people having the privilege to now enter into spaces of the corporate and thereby shift and create a black middle class in South Africa while still maintaining the old guard white force which had already by this time spread itself and sunk itself deep into the literal land as property, dispossessing many people of spaces they consider their homelands, spaces that were akin to their ancestors. None of this was ever addressed. So in the light of there being national symbols, the Protea, the Springbok, in light of South Africa being turned into this place where the flag in itself was an emblem of British power and transformed into this kind of rainbow nation mythology, all built with the tears of Desmond Tutu and a sham commission which really just polished the sins of those that did wrong by, again, attempting to create some kind of PR staging of an apology when there wasn't real grassroots engagement with the culture of what this oppression had made. So it's one thing to hold the actual people accountable, but it's another to follow up into what they made acceptable as a culture in the environment. It's one thing to jail a man for the things he's done, but it's another to live with the consequences of what those things have created in the community. So I think whilst South African leaders who were in charge of this liberation project were aiming at faces and showing people accountability, they were forgetting the most important thing. The ideas that had already sunk themselves deep into the fiber of what this country is, into the very fiber of how we manage our economy. As a result, we move into the era of Thabo Mbeki, where as the second black president, he tries to focus more on the economic capacity of what South Africa can become. Again, forgetting that the economy sits on the very bedrock of white supremacy. So we then run with the same blueprint that was used to oppress us, to try to help us. And here we are, In a South Africa whose energy crisis is looming into a place that many foresee will be unchangeable without drastic and revolutionary steps, to levels of inequality and drastic unemployment that have created a volatile fiber in the streets. Virtually a South Africa that all who live in it, privileged in their own ways, always feel some itch in the back of their neck of how things are constantly becoming increasingly difficult to live in this place. So can we really celebrate the symbol of victory when all of that is in our lives? I say we can. Because while social media and the quote-unquote public opinion online is trying to create the idea that struggles can be separated into moral binaries where there are again good and bad people, and thus we can easily identify those who've wronged us, and we are to stick together in terms of race, we know it's more complex than that. We know that there are black people who've wronged us from among us. We know that there are those who appear to support us when the foundation of what drives them is the very same thing that destroys us. We know that there are many who look at Mandela as a traitor as much as he was a hero, and those who were in cohort with him. Bless his soul. My point is that life in general, South Africa specifically, is littered with contradiction and is inherently duplicitous and somewhat hypocritical, because this is the nature of people. We seek what we desire while still engaging with what we do not yet have. We engage with our wants and our needs in ways that don't easily filter into acceptability or sometimes even ethical lines. Many are in positions where they feel they have to do what is necessary to survive, and necessity often jumps this narrow edge of aesthetic moral acceptability. People who are in the most difficult situations, which visibly do not look well, have to do some of the most visibly uncouth things to make themselves live. I'm not talking just on crime. Those are the obvious sins. But the compromise on oneself constantly in a world that is just designed to limit the capacity of black development is one that borders on spiritual breakdown. So I think in this state of spiritual breakdown, the best thing many people have is the idea of victory, is the idea of having a semblance of something that reminds them that there are crevices of possibility in this dynamic landscape of capitalism. And that even if it is not perfect as it is structured, and when by perfect I mean it doesn't allow for some kind of a radical shift, but there are channels that can open up the portal for some kind of eventual room for oppressed people to do interesting things with the resources that they're able to be given by capitalism. I'm not talking about black excellence, which is simply whiteness choosing popular black faces to reinforce the very same values that sustain it. I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about a black deconstruction, where there is a class of blacks who are aware of what their blackness means to whiteness and who are able to subvertly move in power while still being in these places that demand a certain level of compromise. So there are many ordinary people playing sports, rugby players, black kids who through scholarships were given the opportunity to become professionals. You know who I'm talking about. There are many who might live in the hot seat of trying to figure out how much their privilege as men who might have had the background that allowed them to go to schooling where the sports divisions were clearly funded to a path of success, but their skin color still allows them to be at the very best a tool for the system. How can this be used in a way that really has grounded impacts that will resonate beyond the money making? This is the question a lot of black rugby players actively ask themselves as they play. And I think narrowing down Springboks to simply vessels of mass market control, as if these are not men with their own minds and will and desires, is just turning this whole thing into a conspiracy that is monotonous and unified. And no such thing exists. In politics, even in of itself, these motherfuckers don't agree with each other about anything really. So how on earth do we think that there is a seat of people who have common values that are unified enough to be considered a nation? South Africa is not a nation. Nationhood means common values. We don't have that. What we have is a myth that's been given to us that says unity is possible somehow. And this half-hearted myth is the open door to how we've tried to approach interactions with each other. And it causes more conflict. But then again, is there another way to get to some kind of integrity other than to find out how to fight with each other? So I think that's worth celebrating too. And I think the small steps made by people like Rassie Erasmus to shift the visible face of rugby to one that is more representative of the masses of the country, even though that can be swung capitalistically, where you sell something better because now you have somebody that looks like the people to sell it to them. And Siya Kolisi is being used to sell everything from tomato sauce to insurance. But at the very same time, he's a person who, outside of this money-making scheme, really has the sincere values to try and impact the society in as far as he understands it. So to frame people as if they're some kind of mindless puppets is to strip them of their innate agency. Kolisi has agency. Erasmus has agency. The men that played on that field have agency that goes beyond what capitalism uses them as. The people who support the team have more agency than just buying the t-shirt from a convenience store. The idea of South Africa has more agency than this rigid conception that was initially created as when it began, of European dominance. It's mutated to become something that is not only in the interests of whiteness, but has glimmers that have been filtered by the diverse peoples who exhibit and inhabit within it. So what I'm saying is that these things are way too promiscuous, way too vast, way too diverse, way too fluid for us to rigidly try to define them according to what's good and what is not good. So ultimately, we can celebrate and mourn in the same breath. So what are we celebrating and what are we mourning? Let's talk about it. What we're celebrating is the opportunity to be able to see that capitalism is way more flexible than we think. That within certain boundaries, we are able to make changes. And by we, I mean blacks to blacks and blacks to everybody else. We are able to navigate through this system in order to turn it into whatever it can be tomorrow. And sometimes this can be done by discreetly moving in the backdrop, but most times radical opposition will be necessary. And it will be very, very crucial. It has been and always will be, to understand how to frame real empowering content while still not relegating yourself outside of what you need at the current moment. So at the very best, capitalism can become a strategy to anti-capitalize ourselves into the next step. Indeed, many believe capitalism is already over, and that the era of this hyper-technological age of AI and social media can be called anything from techno-feudalism to post-futuristic state. But whatever it is, all of us are making it. The Springboks are all of us. They do not just represent white interest. The men that play on that field have experiences that go far beyond what any colonizer would have intended and can never intend. And I think if we're going to use influence as some kind of excuse to misconstrue it as colonial power, we're not going to give ourselves the opportunity to penetrate into this genome of capitalism, to mutate it into something more. Because that's what's happening. So, as convoluted and as complex as this issue is, I tried my best to reduce it to two realizations. That if you're going to make the argument one that is moralistic and create a binary where you are a vanguard for a just cause and those that are against you are uncompromisingly deserving of no support, then it will be difficult to truly understand that every person, even the most vile of people, are motivated by the same interest that you are. And that is a sense of sustainability. We're all driven by the need to sustain ourselves and feel empowered in our own contexts. And it is this diverse pockets of ideology where the cultural conflict ensues. But again, this cultural conflict, as difficult as it is, we are all actively moving through it in ways that demand us to think beyond simple binary logic. We need to understand that the people we hate the most are like us in so many ways. And when we understand that, then we'll know how to get through to them and to them in ways that can possibly allow for the dynamic to shift. Because if we hold on to what we are, then we become maintained by the rigidity of ideas. But if we remain fluid, always understanding that we are actually becoming, not in a state of static being. We're always changing. But the question is, what are we changing into? So as South Africans emerge champions, how do we find that championship valid in our own pockets of life? How is the Springbok win boosted my confidence to go out there and work for what I still have the ability to work for? How has it given me the insight to try and understand that not everything is black and white, and that most of life happens in the gray area? How are we able to see that what was formerly a colonial project is actively in gestation and in a place where something new seeks to be born? And if you know anything about the process of something that wants to come into life, there must be labor. And the process of labor is intense, is difficult, and many a times if you were to see what happens before an actual child is born, it's all guts, it's all pain and crying. So how do we think that any new result will happen without a level of friction? How do we not see that wherever there is conflict, something wants to be born? And if something wants to be born, there will be blood, there will be screaming, there will be pushing to try and release new potential. My name is VJ, the brother from the ancient mother. I hope all of this shit was succinct enough for you to get back at me in the comment section. These are multi-layered conversations, but we must have them, because if they don't, we go by and we watch history create itself without us being aware of how we are contributing to that. So one of the things that we aim to do in this channel is constantly analyze the journey as it's unfolding. We will be wrong in many ways, we will be right in many ways, but that's the whole point. Subscribe, talk to us, let's have this group conversation. Obviously not the last time that we talk about things of a pertinent nature in sport and athleticism, so stay tuned.